it's Real Estate Tips Tuesday, and this week's tip, I'm going to continue my Colorado winter series. This can fall into the category of any time of year, but I'm going to include it in our winter series because a lot of people come here for skiing and it's a little bit more intensive than when people come here to camp. So this tip is going to be about altitude sickness. So altitude sickness can hit anybody. Yes, even me, I can get altitude sickness, and I have on occasion experienced some milder versions of altitude sickness. So what is altitude sickness? So altitude sickness is basically moving to a higher altitude than you're normally used to. So in higher altitudes, there is a low barometric pressure. So there's low air pressure, which has less oxygen in it. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to breathe. The symptoms of altitude sickness are similar to those that you would associate with being hungover. So you have headache, you're tired, you're nauseated, shortness of breath, certain things like that. It can also be misdiagnosed as like asthma or pneumonia or cold. So sometimes if you've ever been here and you just feel like crap and you think that you caught a cold like in the airport or, in the mountain resort or something, it's more than likely altitude sickness instead of an actual cold. So now that you know what altitude sickness is, here are some preventative measures that you can take before you come into high altitudes. If you are not, even if you live in lower altitudes in Colorado, but if you come for vacation or if you're moving here from a different state that has a lower altitude than Colorado, then these are some good tips to take into consideration. So tip number 1 is definitely stay hydrated. Drink lots of water. This helps prevent altitude sickness. High altitude causes dehydration. So this is why you need to keep yourself hydrated. The second one is, and it's definitely not something that people are a fan of, and that is to not consume alcohol on the first day of getting here. The reasons are kind of obvious. Drinking alcohol in high altitudes doesn't get you drunker faster because the alcohol level is still the same. What happens is that alcohol and high altitude kind of act as one and the same. When you're at high altitudes, you're kind of already acting what we call high altitude dumbness, where you're at shortness of breath, you're kind of feeling dizzy, you're a little bit kind of disoriented. So when you add alcohol to that, it kind of exasperates these types of behaviors. And it also doesn't help to diagnose the symptoms if you do have altitude sickness. So definitely refrain from drinking our wonderful microbrews here in Colorado for the first 24 to 48 hours when you first get here. The third tip is to acclimate yourself slowly. So if you're coming from a super low altitude, below 1,000 feet, sea level and such, you want to take one day of flying into Denver or to Colorado Springs and just take one day, 24 hours of just, hanging out in a higher but lower altitude than the mountains if that's where your final destination is. So you want to stay in Denver or Colorado Springs or in the metro area for at least 24 hours to let your body acclimate to the lower oxygen levels that are here in high altitude. This also goes to accelerating into the mountains at a slower pace. You kind of want to do it about 1,000 feet at a time. With that being said, it's pretty difficult to get from Denver to the mountains to a ski resort and do it in 1,000 feet increments. So there are some strategies you can take where you can go to a small town in the mountains and enjoy lunch there or breakfast and just kind of, walk around the city, maybe look at some of the stores or do a little adventure there. There's a lot of cool, neat Colorado towns that are on the way to most of the ski resorts here in Colorado. So you can always do that. The next thing you want to do is once you get to your destination in the higher altitudes, you want to refrain from overexerting yourself or exercising too much in high altitudes. So this might put a damper on your ski plans. So you want to try, or even your hiking and biking plans, you want to try to refrain from doing those types of activities on your first day in the mountains, because that can also bring on the altitude sickness. So tip number 5 would be to talk to your doctor about medications if you think that that's going to be an issue for you, or you just don't have the time to acclimate yourself or, slowly ascend into the mountains. The next tip is oxygen. It's actually kind of a booming business here in Colorado where you can buy little personal oxygen tanks. You can see them advertised at the airport and on the little train that goes to and from the terminals. And there's also oxygen bars that you can go to, and you can sit down and you can breathe some of the flavored oxygens that they have to offer. So that is definitely a tip if you believe that you might be more susceptible to altitude sickness. That's another reason why you see athletes, when they come to play at Denver sports teams, they have oxygen tanks on the sidelines to help the other players get some oxygen in so that they don't get sick while they're playing a sport. The last tip is basically just getting down into a lower altitude. If you're feeling sick and you just can't shake it with maybe aspirin or water, or even just trying to acclimate yourself, the best thing to do is just to get down out of high altitude. But you want to do it, slowly. You don't want to, do it really quickly, unless, of course, you're in a life-threatening situation, such as water in the lungs or water on the brain. And those are the more severe symptoms of altitude sickness, which can lead to death. So it can be a fatal sickness, so it really needs to be taken seriously. Most people just have milder symptoms of altitude sickness, which is the headaches, the nausea, the not wanting to eat, the shortness of breath. But you just need to be aware of these symptoms and not just brush it off to perhaps being sick from a cold or you drank too much the night before. You really want to pay attention to those symptoms to make sure that it isn't the case of altitude sickness, because when it does, if it does prolong and you're not paying attention, it can lead to the more severe cases of altitude sickness. I remember when I was a hockey player and who used to have to go up to the mountains to play other teams, we would do some pre-training routines before we went up to the mountains. It sounds silly because I grew up here in Denver and we're at 5,280 feet, a mile above sea level. That's why we're the Mile High City. But if you're going into locations that are 8,000, 10,000 feet, and you're trying to play sport or hike or ski or anything that you're trying to do, it does play a key role into how well you're going to perform if you're not well suited for that type of situation. So we used to do some off-ice training when I was younger, to train to go up into the mountains to play those teams. And we always drank plenty of water prior to going up there to better prepare ourselves for the higher altitudes. And sometimes it worked and we didn't have any issues, but sometimes we had the minor symptoms of being tired, out of breath, lightheaded, hard to breathe. But if you take all of these precautionary steps or preventative measures in the beginning, like drinking lots of water before you get here and kind of just trying to acclimate yourself in smaller amounts, it does help. But if you can't do that, if you're just flying in for the weekend for a quick weekend trip, then the best thing you can do is drink lots of water and stay away from alcohol. And that should help you to prevent some issues with high altitude sickness. You can't prevent it all the time. And if you have a really bad case or you just can't shake it, the best thing to do is to come back down into a lower altitude. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button and subscribe, and also hit the bell notification button so that you can get these great tips into your email box every week. And until next week, have a wonderful rest of your week.